Good morning, all. I realize we're competing with a funeral and a number of other things. I'm thrilled you're here. It's not a question of who isn't, it's a question of who is. An intriguing point. At lunch last week, Brian and I were talking, and he said to me, I hope you understand that as we moved into the 20th century, immigration changed in this country. Up until 1880, it was Northern and Western Europeans, many of us in this room. After 1880, that continued, but all of a sudden, Southern and Eastern Europe begins to show up for a variety of reasons, economic and political primarily. The story today is a story of an immigrant. And her immigrant story is a very intriguing one, and you have to see it as her story, but as our story. It's the story of a woman, and it's the story of America. Ryan, so glad to have you back.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me back. I have a friend. I'm trying to remember my line of sight there. Yeah, I have a friend who's a minister who long ago said, "You always count yeses in rooms." Right? That's the way to do it. I find that very useful. But I'm very glad to see everybody here. As Bob pointed out, we're talking about an immigrant person today, Anzia Jezierska, who was born in Poland in the late 19th century. And she's a literary figure in American history. She's an author in the 19-teens, the 1920s, up through her death after the Second World War. But Jezierska was born in the 1880s to a Jewish family in Poland, which at that time was part of the Russian Empire. The Jezierskas were a poor family. Her dad was a scholar. He was a Jewish scholar of the Talmud, which meant that the family essentially existed to support his intellectual pursuits, to support his life of the mind. So where they grew up, when they grew up, the community would have seen a lot of value in their family, right? Yes, they were poor. Yes, they scraped by, but the community saw her father as an important intellectual figure, an important source of counsel, a religious figure in the community. So there's sort of an honor in that sort of upbringing and growing up in that kind of family. There's a certain amount of respect that comes from being somebody like her father. Typically in these sorts of homes, the daughters tended to work to support their father and also the sons. If you grew up in a family like the Jezierskas and there were sons in the family, and she did have brothers, the brothers' real vocation in life was studying the Talmud with their father. So I'm bringing this up now because from an American perspective, this doesn't look normal, right? From an American perspective, the idea of like raising sons to stay at home with dad and read, even if it is an intellectual pursuit, while the daughters work to make money to support their father and their sons, that's a bit disjointed from how Americans tend to think families should function. And it's often as these sorts of people, as Bob pointed out, we talked last week, they're becoming more of the normal immigrant after 1880. As these types of people tend to immigrate to the United States, it becomes seen as a sort of source of problems in the United States. People who were native born in the United States tended to see families from these sorts of backgrounds as less than prepared to fit in American society. So I'm mentioning this because when the Jezierskas leave Poland, they have to escape the pogroms, and they show up on the Lower East Side of New York City in 1893. They show up as a family unit. One of her elder brothers had come a year or two prior to sort of pave the way to find work, to find housing, and that sort of thing, and to bring the entire family over. But when the family moves, they are expecting to continue living the sort of life that they've been living in Poland, right? From the Jezierskas' perspective, They are not moving to the United States to become American. They are moving to the United States because it provides them the best possible opportunity to continue living the sort of life they have always lived and want to continue living according to their traditions. And I'll just mention that tends to be a rather common theme in immigration history. Whether we're talking the early 1800s, whether we're talking 1900, whether we're talking today, people who immigrate tend to come here because we tend to have a lot of gold nuggets, right? We tend to have the paychecks that people need to be the people that they were raised to be. So the family, when they move, Jezierska assumes a new name. She renames herself Harriet Mayer, right? So she's from Poland. Her parents are Bernard and Pearl Jezierska. They're on the Lower East Side. By 1893, this is a picture of Anzia, now Harriet, at about 13 or 14 years old. Right, so she's early in adolescence when this portrait gets taken. And again, what the Jezierskas are going through is really on the cutting edge of what the immigrant experience in the United States has come. Americans had never particularly thought or worried about immigration until the late 1880s, early 1890s. The assumption was people who immigrated to the United States, typically because of their Western and Northern European backgrounds, were very similar to Americans in terms of religion, in terms of language, in terms of family structure, in terms of ethics. So essentially, you could come from Ireland, you could come from Germany, which were the two most important sources of immigrants up until the 1880s. And if you were given the right to earn money, if you were given the right to participate in the political process, you would sort of naturally become American, right? That exercising American liberties would make you American. And it would just happen without really forcing it. So what's changing for people like the Jezierskas is because of the sheer numbers of immigrants coming to the United States, starting in the 1880s and really lasting up to about 1914. What's happening in the world by 1914? Anybody want to guess? The First World War started by, so immigration across the Atlantic is, boop, it's pinched off, right? So there's this period here where there are tons of new immigrants coming to the United States. In fact, the American population will double in size between 1870 and 1900, from roughly 38 million to 76 million Americans, and that is overwhelmingly due to immigration, right? Yeah, like natural increases a little bit, like Americans get a little healthier, life expectancy goes up like a couple of years. But most Anglo-Saxon families actually are shrinking in size in the late 19th century as they transition into a new way of life because of industrial capitalism, right? The new white-collar middle class tended to go from having somewhere between 6 and 9 kids to having somewhere between like 3 and 5 kids. So most of this change is because of immigration. And of course, they're very different people with very different traditions, right? They're Catholic, they're Jewish, they're Greek Orthodox, right? So these are people who Americans begin to perceive of as a threat for 2 reasons, or a problem for 2 reasons. One is it's always jobs, right? It's always jobs. It's jobs today, it was jobs in the late 19th century. It's always competition for dollar bills. This is the first reason people worry about immigration. The second thing in the late 19th century, and I think this also tends to be an influence today, is difference of cultural traditions. Right? So there's this concern that this old process wherein if you give people the ability to vote and you give people the ability to own property, they will just become American, that seems less likely because they're not becoming American. Right? As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, the Jezierskas have no sense that they're moving to the United States to become Americans. They're literally moving to the United States because they want to remain Jewish. Right? They want to remain Eastern European, and they can't live that way where they're at because of the Russian policies towards Jewish people in the late 19th century. So the catchphrase becomes assimilation. Right? The catchphrase becomes assimilation. People begin having conversations about how to best coerce immigrants into becoming more like native-born Americans. Right? This is one of the great themes of the early 20th century. And that's not assured at first, right? There's a conversation taking place around 1900 about what's the best way to help immigrants blend into the United States or fit into American society. And one side is the famous melting pot theory of American society, that you are melted down into a common quality, that you change America and are changed, but you become more American when you're here. You become more like everybody else. The competing theory is a more heterogeneous theory, right? It's the theory of pluralism, right? A number of Americans said, you know, immigrants, especially different immigrants, are going to strengthen our society because of their difference. Rather than the melting pot, a number of these thinkers posited a theory called the symphony of society. So if you have a music background, you know that when you get large symphonies together, you have many different types of instruments, you have many different types of sounds, but when these things do what they're supposed to do correctly, it makes one beautiful whole. So this is the theory of pluralism at the turn of the 20th century, is that it's not dangerous that these people don't want to assimilate, they don't want to melt down, because they have something as individuals that we need, and we just need to learn how to be harmonious. We need to learn how to channel all of this in one direction. So again, remember that Harriet, as she's calling herself by 1900, she knows about this conversation. This is part of her daily life as a young Jewish woman. She knows how people see her. She knows that, you know, as a Jewish Polish immigrant, that she is seen as problematic, which probably explains the name change, right? Well, I will show that I'm adopting in some way so that I get left alone. So, Anzia, as I will refer to her for today's talk, leaves home as a teenager. She gets a little bit of school. Her brothers begin prepping for college. Again, a lot of Jewish families put a lot of emphasis on intellectual achievement. So there's a lot of emphasis as these young people adjust to life in the United States. They begin to see like Talmudic study, not necessarily as a path to success, but intellectual pursuits as a path to success, right? So she kind of like, you know, gets through her teenage years, and then all of a sudden the world discovers her in 1922. So she's a grown woman. She's at work writing, and she gets discovered because of a series of short stories that she published called Hungry Hearts. And Hungry Hearts comes out, it's published in 1920, but it's made into a movie by Samuel Goldwyn Mayer. This is the head of what becomes MGM Studios in 1922. So this is sort of like this is a big moment in her life. This is her discovery, right? That there is this young woman nobody knows toiling away at life, and Samuel Goldwyn Mayer discovers this book, turns it into a movie, and basically makes her into a success overnight. The story, the Hungry Hearts book itself, it's a series of short stories or vignettes about what it's like to be Jewish on the Lower East Side. And even though it's published first in 1920, it's really a book about 1890s and early 1900s New York City, right? So it's really kind of set in the past. And a lot of the themes that come out are, you know, I think what we might see as fairly typical, like immigrant stories. There's divisions between kids and their parents, tradition and change. There's a recognition that because you're an immigrant, you have a particular class identity in the United States, and that your opportunities are going to be shaped by that. There's a lot of struggle in the characters, particularly young woman characters, trying to decide, you know, who do I want to be as an adult? Do I want to admire American culture and try and emulate that, or do I need to remain like the type of person my parents want me to remain, or is there some kind of middle ground I can strike out? When the telegram came announcing the sale of Hungry Hearts to MGM, it came at just the right time. Anzia was facing eviction from this tiny little room she was living in on Hester Street. And Hester Street was a very famous Jewish neighborhood in New York City. It's on the Lower East Side. She gets news that he's interested, and she has to pawn this shawl that she owns for a nickel to get the money to telephone the agent who is handling the negotiation. So this is a sort of a heart-wrenching moment in her story where she has this shawl that's been handed down to her from her mother, and it's the only thing she has of any value that she can turn in for some cash. And you know, the pawnbroker will only give her a nickel for this old shawl, but she decides, I have to do it, because if I don't literally give up a piece of my past, if I don't give up this thing my mother has given me, I will have no future. So I have to do this. So she pawns the shawl, she makes the telephone call, and she is whisked to Hollywood, where she meets with Samuel Goldwyn. Goldwyn would give her a $100,000 contract to write screenplays, and the press begins to refer to her as the so-called sweatshop Cinderella. This is the sort of identity she takes on. Is like, oh, this poor woman who is toiling away with no opportunities, sewing garments on the Lower East Side, is rescued by this filmmaker who thrusts her into the limelight and gives her this tremendous, ungodly amount of money, $100,000, to continue writing these sorts of stories for him. People loved this story in the early 1920s because it confirmed America was working, right? It confirmed that immigrants like Yezierski could come to the United States, pay their dues, keep their nose clean, and ultimately they would get noticed, right? They would get picked out of poverty and helped out. Yezierska herself would tire of screenwriting after a couple of years. She really wanted to be a serious novelist rather than just like churn out melodramas for cash. She writes another book during these years, that's Salome of the Tenements. Salome of the Tenements comes out in 1923, and then that is adapted into a film of the same title in 1925. And again, Salome of the Tenements is a story about a young immigrant woman who yearns to be more American, and she sets her heart on marrying a wealthy American man. This is, to her, a sign of success, right? If this wealthy American man marries me, I will be his wealthy wife. People will respect me. But ultimately, what she learns is that really that's not going to make her happy. And instead, she settles into a career and meets a man who is more of a partner to her, and they go on to have this very happy life. It helps that he is an immigrant like she is, so they are alike but very different. Yezierska was back in New York City within a year or two, and she continues writing about immigrant women. So that brings us to The Bread Givers, which is the novel that she is probably best known for, right? Bread Givers is a fictionalized account of Yezierska's immigration to the United States and her childhood and her teenage years. She is essentially Sarah Smolinski, right? Her parents are turned into Reb and Sheena Smolinski as well. So when the book opens, and I should point out, last week at lunch, I was asked, like, oh, what's the Bread Giver sort of a reference to? And it's actually a rather sarcastic title, because the Bread Givers refers to the three daughters in the book who are working to support the father. Like, they are the bread givers of the family. It's these women who are supporting the men in the household. So 10-year-old, that's right. Yeah. And it's there, and it's this idea of like giving themselves, right? They're the ones who have to give life to everybody else, who give opportunity to everybody else in the family, particularly the men. And so, really quick question. What's interesting about this kind of reference to breadwinners versus bread givers, do you think? How does that strike you? Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, I was wondering if that was what you were thinking. I agree with you, right? Is that, breadwinners, it seems to be macho, very male. It's like men go out and win dinner, right? Whereas women are expected to give of themselves, right? Women are expected to provide. And so she's making this argument with the title, like, this is a story about women. This is a story about what immigrant women have to do so that their families succeed in the United States, and whether or not really they're willing to do that long term. Because we meet Sarah Smolinski when she's 10. She is the protagonist and the narrator of the story. She's living in a tenement with her Orthodox Jewish father. All the girls in the family work to support Dad, who studies the Torah. So very early on, what readers learn is this family is not becoming American, right? That the parents of the family want them to remain Old World, want them to remain wedded to certain traditions. Now, what we also learn is that for Smolinski, this is a problem, right? She watches the family toil in poverty. She watches her father take and take and take of the bread that his daughters give him. He takes her older sisters and marries them off to men who they do not love, but are potential good earners to support him in his studies. And so as the youngest daughter, she sees this coming, right? She knows what is in store for her if she stays with the family. She ultimately escapes the fate that her older sisters fall into, being married off to men they do not love, who are not good people, but are there solely for their money, by lucking into a scholarship that allows her to get a college education and live a Spartan existence studying to become a teacher. It's important to point out that when she makes this jump to like leaving her family's house and striking out on her own, in entering this very American world of the college, that she is not accepted. She does not fit in at the college. The other people there are all people who are born in the United States, who come from middle-class backgrounds or upper backgrounds. She doesn't interact with them well. She doesn't accept them, and they do not accept her. Right? So very quickly, you get the idea that this idea of assimilation isn't going to work for her either. Right? So she's kind of stuck between two poles. That's really what the second half of the book is about. She'll deny herself the comfort of a relationship with the man she loves because he wouldn't give her the freedom to work. She sticks with college and tries to join social circles but doesn't fit in. She ultimately graduates and returns home with cash from an essay contest she had won to find her mom on her deathbed. Her mother dies. Her dad remarries quickly, which angers his daughters who disown him. The stepmother tries to ruin her career by slandering her to her principal. That fails. And in the end, she begins dating said principal, who is also Jewish and Polish. So the book ends with the couple taking in her father.
When does she change her name?
In real life, I'm sorry?
When does she change her name?
To Harriet,
Yes.
she does that when she's about 14 or 15 in real life. Yeah, she's very young.
For the publications.
Ma'am?
She kept it for the publications.
Yes, I'm so glad you noticed that.
I keep waiting for you to tell me that she's changed her name. Changed her name?
I'm getting there.
So it's an older book.
I figured you would.
No, this is her actual name. She takes an American name when she's 13 or 14, but when she becomes an author, she begins using her original name again. Because, and here's the hint, she perceives there to be value in being a Jewish immigrant. She perceives that there's some advantage to being this person rather than to blending in. And that's what the novel's about. It's about a young woman trying to figure out, to succeed in life, do I have to blend in? Or do I have to remain wedded to my immigrant traditions? Or is there some middle ground that I have to trend? So what the book ultimately suggests is that there's a middle ground, that it's possible for her to remain who she was raised, but that satisfaction in life will become by adopting to new values, like becoming an educated teacher who gets married to somebody who's very much like her, also an immigrant and also educated. So they are old but also new, all at the same time. So what I find interesting about the book is how critics respond to it in the 1920s, right? The response is very much shaped by a 3 decades long progressive era mission to establish assimilation as a key to understanding the immigrant experience. So in general, the critics who are reading this book and writing about it in newspapers and literary magazines and telling people whether or not they should read this book, how they should understand it, all assume that when you hear about an immigrant, what you should hear about is a person who was one thing and become something new because they've come to the United States. And they have become more American in the process. Reviewers tended to measure her according to how well she assimilated. Right? So a lot of the critical response is this person authentic because she has become more American? The value in the book is going to be measured in whether or not she can prove she has become more American by the time she has written this book. Right? So they want to have their ideas confirmed. Critics want to feel good. Right? They want to feel like, yes, the way we do things is correct.
But being an American is a middle-class, white American Protestant.
Correct. Correct. That is the goal. And there's a much larger progressive era history here about assimilation and coerced assimilation and using the power of local, state, and federal governments to create schools, home economics projects, social workers that will go into immigrant homes and essentially encourage, but not quite force them to be cooking, cleaning, educating, and living lives that are more white, middle class, and Protestant types of lives. And that's what Jezierska is sort of struggling with is that expectation. So reviewers tended to point to the clash between the older people in the book and the younger people in the book in this desire for an ideal existence in a new country. Other reviewers tended to emphasize Sarah's struggle upward as a quest for success and education that her family couldn't provide. There's your Cinderella motif and assimilation. And ultimately, they describe the book as a very American story written by someone who was made a success by American money and opportunities. So a lot of the critical response is positive. Right? They're like, hey, this is a great book. We should all be reading this book to understand immigrants. This book tells us that this woman is a success because she made herself into somebody who could be hired by Louis Mayer, writing these stories. She has become more American. She's telling a story that only she can tell, but it's one that emphasizes American success and assimilation. Other critics said that, it's a great book, but also she suffers from the use of passionate language. And passionate was a very deliberate word that they used. I'd like us to think about that word for a second, passionate. Right? Because it can mean a couple of different things. It can be praise or it can be condemnation, right? So if somebody's language is passionate, if you're describing somebody as a passionate writer, like what are you actually saying about them? I wonder if you have ideas about that or thoughts. Right? There's an emotional response. They elicit a feeling. Did you want to add something as well? Yeah.
They're very emotional, as opposed to, right brain as opposed to left
Right,
brain.
yeah.
Kind of a slam on women.
Oh gosh, so you saved us 5 minutes, right? But yeah, the flip on this is, but you're a woman, you're being emotional when you write. And if you're being emotional and passionate when you write this story, you're not being, and again, I'm putting big Ryan Anderson air quotes around this. I'm not saying this. You're being too emotional, honey. Right? Which, by the way, I do not say to my wife. I said that to my wife early in our relationship. We all change. We all make adjustments. I have learned that is not a good way to communicate. Right? You're not thinking, you're feeling. No, let's not do that. But again, this is what critics are saying. They're like, yeah, it's a really great story, but she's a little passionate, and so it's sort of saying the code here is discredits her as somebody who has something serious to say. Passionate can also, this sort of loss of emotion, if we put it in the context of Americans versus immigrants, can be used to make her into an exotic figure. So her value then is, well, she's different, she's exotic. She is still defined by her difference, not by being somebody who can write the way literary critics expect somebody properly trained to write. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And Yezierska would suffer to some extent, like she has this career in the 20s writing, but like ultimately, Jewish audiences thought she was too mainstream, that she was too watered down, because she's actually employing some like Jewish literary traditions in these novels. And they're saying, you're essentially a sellout, right? But American mainstream reading audiences thought she was too passionate and exotic to really be taken seriously. So her career really kind of stalls out by the late 1920s. And to be fair, Yezierska sort of helps embolden this understanding of her work. She helps critics say these things about her. She helps shape this reception. This is again, this is a review and article about Yezierska, and you can see this comes out in 1925. I don't know if you can. I had to clip it in such a way. I don't know if you can tell what publication it's in, but this comes out in the Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette. So where's Cedar Rapids? Iowa. It's in Iowa City. So this is the most middle American response possible to this book. Now, to be honest, this is probably a boilerplate story. Like somebody in Iowa probably didn't write this. It was probably written by somebody in New York, but then reprinted. But I point that out because it's the way many Americans across the country would have understood her, because this is what's defining her book to them, no matter where they live. And so again, that idea of like she's a Cinderella story. You know, somehow like 5 years after her first book, she's still a Cinderella story. But in this interview, right, she tells the person writing the story that I know that in this grinding waste of the dull everyday lay buried a rich drama more colorful than any faked heroics of fiction. So she's saying it's in the daily experience of the immigrant that there are real little dramas happening. Like I knew what was important was a story of people who were different, people who are unlike the average American. Right? That's who I am. She's saying, yeah, I'm exotic. Right? I'm different. My value is in that I see things you can't see because you don't come from this immigrant background. This conviction that the poorest life is rich enough for the greatest story, that the real struggle of the washerwoman, shop girl, fishwife, and these are my italics, my emphasis, no matter how sordid, how ugly, throbs with dramatic beauty, goaded me to write. So without any plot or plan, without knowing how, I started to set down the life I had lived. Why am I emphasizing that particular stretch of text, do you think? What would I find interesting about that as a historian?
Certainly it's her passion.
Mm-hmm. It's her passion. Like she is moved.
Yeah.
Right? This is not a woman who's been to college and has been educated to be a writer. This is a woman who's saying, I was working in factories, I was sewing garments, I was struggling, but I looked around me and saw how other immigrants were living, and I said, this is important, and I have to write this down. I have to tell these stories that nobody else sees. And I think it's important to point out, she says, without any plot or plan. So this was not, she's arguing, calculated at all. Like there's a natural talent here that you're recognizing. I just happened to get discovered. I got lucky, right? A lot of hard work went into it, but it's there. She described her writing process. She said that for years she had, anytime she saw something of interest, jotted it down on a scrap piece of paper or a brown paper bag, and that she threw it into this little carpet bag she had, and that's what she refers to as her rag bag of dreams, the dreams being these things she sees happening on Hester Street around her, right? So again, it's not a writing process. I just collected these little bits and pieces, and then eventually I crafted a story out of that by being honest. So, what she's telling us here is that what's important about her is that she isn't a normal American, that she isn't totally Americanized, that she doesn't totally fit in. On the same hand, she also said, you know, I have not necessarily succeeded the way I wanted. I have not been taken as seriously as I want because of America and because of the movie industry. I began again, she's talking about having written some stories and running them past friends. And them saying, you need to redo this. I began again, but it was another year of anguish writing before Bread Givers was ready. Now my only regret is that I allowed the American hurry to rush me into print too soon. So she's saying, okay, look, this book hasn't really made me the literary figure I hoped it was, but that's not my fault. That's not my shortcoming. It's the American hustle to produce and to create literary commodities that get turned into movies. Like that's what's really hurt me. So she hears, again, this is a woman who grew up on the Lower East Side. She knows what Americans think of immigrants. And they're saying, you're too passionate, you're too this, you're too that. And she's going, well, I'm only that because you made me do this way. You didn't allow me to demonstrate. So she's trying to like have her bread, have her cake and eat it too. So ultimately, what happens to Yezierska is that it's a little sad, to be honest. I hate to be sad about this, but she just sort of like struggled on for a number of years. She didn't publish another novel until 1950. She spent the Depression sort of writing, books that didn't really succeed well. She got a job with the WPA during the Depression, labeling trees in Central Park in New York City. So she's just sort of like scraping by. And a lot of what people are responding to by the post-war period, by 1950, she writes a book called Red Ribbon on a White Horse, which is the story of her entire life. It's essentially a memoir. And what the American Jewish Yearbook says of that book and of her other works is kind of typified by this response to Hungry Hearts. So this comes out in the 1950s, and it's like an encyclopedia entry about that first book she published. That it's vivid, that it deals with the Russian Jew in the New York ghetto, which by the 1950s is a rather loaded term in urban America. And that it's revealing the immigrant, hungry of heart and struggling desperately to achieve, but not merely material, but also spiritual betterment in America, made in a motion picture. So they're saying like, yeah, this is like a nice little snapshot of what life was like in 1920, but it's not really particularly successful. It's not really particularly important. So she dies a couple of years after this and essentially falls into obscurity. There was a brief vogue in the 60s for some of her writing because feminist scholars and scholars writing a new immigrant history in the 60s and 70s were looking for authentic voices from the turn of the 20th century. And so they tended to go to her books because they thought that she had sort of been overlooked and mistreated in a lot of ways. So she was seen as like a real voice that had been ignored because she was an immigrant, because she was a woman, because she had all of these things working against her. What historians and literary scholars of the 1970s and 80s tended to say about her was that her story represented an oppressed immigrant girl made to work to support men like her father. They're talking about Bread Givers here. That she escaped that home but found more exploitation in Hollywood. And now that she had been discovered, she really represented a history from the bottom up. So there's this movement in the 70s to create history from the bottom up, like start at the ground level and work up rather than starting with presidents and generals and legislatures and work down. So that's why they're describing her in that way. Other literary scholars asserted she had never really evolved as a writer, and that's why she had sort of fallen into anonymity and never become a great writer. That she stayed way too wedded to melodramatic immigrant stories and never evolved as a thinker or becoming anything new. So why had she not failed? or why had she not succeeded, why had she failed? It was essentially her own fault, right? Either it was her own fault because she didn't evolve, or it was misfortunate that she was born ahead of her time and wasn't recognized for who she really was. Okay, so the million-dollar question. How would it change that assessment of her life's work, what we think about her and how valuable she is as an immigrant author, if we knew most of what people thought about her and her books were based on lies that Yezierski created about herself? This is the plot twist, Bob. He was trying to get me to tell him what I was going to talk about last week at lunch, and I said, I can't tell you everything. There's too many spoiler alerts in all of this. So Yezierski's only daughter, a woman named Louise Levitas Henriksen, writes a biography of her mother. And this helps spurs a lot of reconsideration of Yezierski as a writer. It provides an alternative interpretation of sorts. If you read this book, what you learn, and this book comes out in 1988, right? So keep in mind that for like 20, 25 years, people have been teaching Yezierski in literary classes on the college level. They've been using her writings in history classes to introduce students to outsider voices in American history. And then along comes her daughter who says, y'all don't really know who this person was. Here's who she actually was. That'll take you down a peg or two as a professor, by the way. Like this is why students are like, just tell me what the truth is, tell me what the basic thing is. I'm like, well, I can't really, because I'm basing everything on what we know, but there's a whole lot we don't know out there. So I'm going to give you my version of the truth, is what I typically say, but you're free to come up with your own. As a girl, she had gotten 2 years of elementary school in New York before working at a succession of domestic and factory jobs. It turned out she had multiple older brothers, not just this one who came ahead of her. 4 of them studied pharmacy. 1 of them became a high school math teacher, and another an officer in the Army. At about 13, she left her parents' apartment and moved into the Clara de Hirsch home for working girls. According to her daughter, Yezierska promised patrons to become a domestic science teacher to help better her people, and made up a high school education for her application to Columbia University. So she became a really good American because she learned how to tell people what they wanted to hear, and then lied on her application to get the best possible, college acceptance letter. So she's telling people at this working girls' home, yeah, I'll go to school and I'll become a home ec teacher so that I can teach other immigrants how to be more American. Don't worry, just like give me the money to stay out of my dad's home and to stay here, rather than having to be at my house so I can be more independent. And then she never finishes her high school education, so she applies to Columbia and just says, yeah, I've got a high school diploma, no worries. I'm ready to go, and they end up accepting her. She works her way through Columbia Teachers College from 1901 to 1905. She taught elementary school from 1908 to 1913, although she did leave for a short period of time to attend the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. She starts writing in 1913, which again I'll point out is like a full 7 years before being discovered for writing Hungry Hearts. So I'd like to point out that Yezierska was assimilated, right? She figured out how to get ahead in the United States. She figured out how to be American. She wasn't this poor immigrant working girl until 1920 when she suddenly got discovered as this exotic flower of a Jewish background. She also got married during these years and had her only child. She first married a man named Jacob Gordon, who was a lawyer. So again, good middle class, she finds a lawyer, good middle class professional man to marry. But you'll like this even better. The following year, the marriage was annulled when she decided she would rather marry his friend, who was a teacher and also a textbook writer named Arnold Levitas, and that's the name that her daughter ends up taking, right? There are, I think, some suggestions here that she's making decisions about who to marry based on her career aspirations, right? I mean, she dumps the lawyer for the guy with ties in the editing world, I think that's, again, I'm sure she loved them. I'm sure they were great, but there's also a decision being made that is good for her and her career as well. Louise is born in 1912, then 4 years later moved to San Francisco with Louise. She leaves the husband and they go to San Francisco. She works as a social worker for a little bit. She sends Louise back to New York City to live with her dad, and then they get a formal divorce in 1916. By 1917, Yezierska is back in New York City and working at Columbia University with John Dewey. Does anybody recognize the name John Dewey? Yeah, who's Dewey? He's central to modern American education. What concept is he most associated with? Different Dewey. Yes, student-centered learning. Dewey's the guy who says all education should revolve around a student's interests and then build out from that, like the idea of intrinsic rather than extrinsic learning. The School of Educations have been reinventing John Dewey since 1910. Like, there's really not a new idea in education. It just sort of gets redone and repackaged in a lot of ways. So she's working with Dewey. He has gotten a federal grant to work on a study of the Polish community in Philadelphia. So she is of value to him, and she recognizes that. And so she's using her own background to get this work and to feed off his grant. They have, you'll really love this, they have some kind of romantic relationship. We don't know if it was requited or not. We only learn, and if you know who John Dewey is, like, this is surprising because John Dewey is not romantic at all. Like, there's nothing romantic about this man. But apparently he was really great at love letters because they found them 30 years later in his desk when he retired, and some junior faculty member inherited his old desk. It opens up this drawer and is like, what's all this love poetry? It's written by John Dewey? So they have some kind of relationship. She breaks it off, and then he was still married, so she broke it off. And she uses this as a lot of the material for her second book, Salome. So I have thoughts. I have some things I think about all of this alternative story, who tells us a little more about who Anzia Yezierska really was. I think it changes the narrative she created to explain her voice as an immigrant author during the 1920s. I think first and foremost, that story she's telling the AP and interviewers about, oh, I'm this poor girl in a factory struggling, when she was actually hooking up with John Dewey and living off of his grant, it's a story that makes her into a victim, right? It makes her a sympathetic character. It makes her this poor girl that needed saving. She knows that if she's that kind of person, that she can portray herself as somebody that deserves another chance, that deserves to be read again and again and again. She's not ruined by her success. In fact, I think she embraced assimilation as a tactic for liberation as a woman who is Jewish, which ran against this typical narrative that Americans believe that immigrants weren't assimilating, right? The fear is that people like her weren't becoming American enough, and so by the 1920s, she could still write as an immigrant, when in reality, she's become American, right? But that's not what people wanted to hear. She was not necessarily that type of person because she knew how to succeed in life. But Americans wanted her to be this romantic version of an immigrant girl because for them, it told them that their American values, those middle-class Protestant values, were superior, right? If she had adopted those values and still not succeeded, that's not a very good story. But if she's never been exposed to those values and gets recognized in the 20s for being this sort of hybrid person, then that makes her valuable because it says, well, the reason we haven't discovered her yet is because she hasn't become American enough. But now she will, right? And she will know her lane. She's told by critics she has to evolve as a writer to be a better writer and artist. But the problem is this. What happens if she quits writing these stories as an immigrant girl? What do you think is going to happen to her?
There's no market.
Yeah, the market dries up. she gets no book contracts. Her career is over because nobody wants to hear the story of a woman who's assimilated into America. They want to hear the story of somebody who's still struggling with that problem so they can say, here's how you succeed in life. So if she evolves, she can't find work to support herself. So she chooses to continue playing this role of an exotic immigrant woman. And unfortunately, what happens is that market dries up eventually. By the 1930s, people don't want to hear that story anymore. And she's become a one-trick pony, and she's left with no options, which is why she's writing these WPA placards in New York City in the mid-1930s and doesn't publish again until the 1950s. So I think a lot of her books and a lot of her life say as much about problems tied to American attitudes towards immigrants as they do portray how to succeed narrative for understanding immigrants, right? She succeeded as long as she could fit into American ideas about what immigrants were like. And I think like immigrants today, people like Anzia Yezierski want to become somebody different than what their traditions allow, but they also don't want to accept who Americans want to pigeonhole them as at the same time. And Americans tend to see immigrants still today as exotic or dangerous. So people today have to find ways to negotiate both expectations from a larger society and expectations from their family that they remain who they really, quote unquote, really are. And this is something I'll just say like anecdotally, I see time and again, particularly these days with my students who come from Hispanic backgrounds, right? One of the things we've realized in the last couple of years is that we have assumptions about what you have to do to succeed in college, and that involves having your booty in a seat every single class and being ready to take notes and engage in conversation and sound like you know what's going on. But the reality is, particularly for our Hispanic students, even the most successful ones is they won't always be in that seat because they can't be. Because mom and dad, even as college students, need their labor, need them working in a family business, need them to drive them to a medical appointment and translate, that they need them to continue doing things they expect of them because of their own family traditions. We tend to see this as a problem. There are some studies, however, suggesting that perhaps having to live this kind of life is actually a strength, that it's a virtue. That what they're learning is that they can continue to draw on important parts of their traditions and their family support to be successful in ways we don't expect them to be successful. So this is going to be a continued, an interesting thing for us to continue thinking about, particularly as educators in the next quarter century, next half century, is how do we change our expectations of students who we think are in the classroom to become more like us, when in reality, they want to become what they want to become, which may not match up with our expectations, but may be equally valid. So I appreciate you being here. Is there anything that we can talk about? Is there anything interesting that you heard you want to know more about, or any observations? Yes, sir.
I spent almost 30 years as a community college in a rural, working class environment.
Yeah.
And I think what you said about Hispanic students, I didn't have very many Hispanic students.
Yeah.
My kids tended to be white or African American,
Mm-hmm.
but very similar.
Yeah.
Most of my students were married, had jobs.
Yeah.
A number of them had children,
Mm-hmm.
and lots of obligations outside.
Yeah.
I taught for a number of years, 4-year university,
Mhm.
East Carolina University of Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
The best students I ever had in a teaching career for the community college students were balancing those
Yeah.
different obligations and those different expectations.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what you say really rings true.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a problem in American education in general. I mean, K through college, is we don't always agree what education should do. And that's tied to the immigrant experience. Should education work to essentially create a similar society, a more homogeneous society where we all agree on what basic principles are and have very similar experiences? and goals, or should it work to create a little more of a heterogeneous society where we have different people who are enabled to act different ways to shore up weaknesses that we have? And we tend to be more comfortable with the homogenous side, right? That's why education tends to look the way it looks. Like, let's all put these chairs in rows, let's all study common stuff, let's all give them the same tests, let's all establish the same expectations, because we tend to be more comfortable with we're all going to be alike rather than we're all going to be different and understand each other.
But isn't that the key?
Yeah.
The question that we can't answer, seemingly, is what is it to be an American?
Yeah. It's ever evolving, right, to be an American.
I hope.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that Bob says, I mean, that this is kind of the key is learning how to change, learning how to think so that you can adapt and understand difference.
Yeah, the problem is, as an old white guy,
Mm-hmm.
I'm in charge.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I want to give up my in charge.
It's once you have that sense of privilege or power, it's very difficult to let go of that. I have a similar problem. I mean, I have a similar mindset. You know, as the professor in the classroom, I have a difficult time letting go of, well, I'm the expert. You know, I've got a PhD, I've spent years studying and reading, you're going to listen to me and repeat back the information. But, you know, some of the best classes I have had are the classes where I have a game plan that fails and the students fix it. And usually because they come from a different background. Yes, ma'am.
All the time you were talking about her,
Yeah.
I kept thinking about this, that she couldn't decide if she was part of the soup theory or the stew theory.
Right.
That simplistic thing that I use with high school
Right.
students. Do you become like the soup?
Right.
Where you lose all the flavor
Uh-huh.
of the individuals to melt
Sure.
together?
Mhm.
Or do you become the stew where you keep the core
Yeah.
and become a part of a bigger thing?
Right.
But you have kept the central core.
Yeah. The things that are most
Yeah,
important.
high school students could understand that. It's very
Yeah. Yeah.
simplistic.
But it works.
Yeah.
But it works, right?
It does, but she couldn't decide.
You're right.
She went from one to the other.
Right, because either option wasn't good for her, right? So I think this is what's important. Thank you for making that comment, because it kind of brings us back to a big idea, which is to be an immigrant in the United States is to be somebody who can't fit in the way other people expect it to. So she's, like you say, she's stuck between soup and stew, and she dips into either bowl when she needs to. But I think that must have been, I think about what it would have been like to be 65, 70 years old and to look back at your life's work and feel like you never were really understood and you never really got heard for what you did. And it's because you knew that you weren't going to be accepted. You weren't going to be understood because you didn't fit into what people thought was normal. And how you had spent your whole life trying to like balance that, you know? That must have been so difficult for her.
Anyone else? Ryan, again, extremely grateful for the moment. Wonderful sense of all of our conversations have so much more, and that's what you're going to carry away. If you have nothing else to do at lunch, look across the table and say to the person who's sitting there, what do you think it means to be an American? A thought. Right on your wrist, we don't meet next week. That's what helicopter pilots do all the time. They write on their wrist. But we do meet 2 weeks from today. And we have no idea what we're going to do. But don't tell us. It's a mystery. Friends,
Between soup and stew. I don't know how long I'm going to be.
go in peace.